So this work is with Andrea Baron-Kelly. He's a physicist at University College London, and my training is in sociology and physics. So this is really a cross-disciplinary project that melds perspectives from sociology and physics. And what we're trying to understand is how social norms or social conventions more generally emerge spontaneously in populations. And one of the sort of orienting ways of thinking about this, really coming from the sociological and physics literatures, is to think about it as a diffusion process. And so typically we think of a population of individuals who are connected in some kind of social structure, a network. And the individuals shown in green are people who are sort of susceptible. They haven't adopted anything. And then the red node is an individual who's been seeded. You can think of this almost like an epidemiology model. A pathogen has been seeded into the population. And as people interact with each other, that contagion spreads from person to person through the sort of social influence process. And then ultimately, through the social network, saturates the population. Now, this way of thinking about the spread of social norms, the emergence of social conventions, social change more generally, is what my literature and the literature before me over the last decades has worked on. So I want to make it really clear that what I'm going to talk about today is a significant departure from this approach. Right? And the reason for that is that this way of thinking about social norms and behavior change more generally really assumes that a behavior is a binary thing. You're either doing it or not doing it. And this is appropriate for thinking about something like a disease, or even just thinking about like technology adoption, where it's binary. You adopt or don't adopt. And if you did adopt, there's kind of a wave of diffusion that follows the sort of track of adopters. When we think about norms, right, real behaviors that people engage in, they're actually much more responsive to how we interact with each other. In addition to people sort of being able to listen to how other people are reacting to them, and then evaluate and change their responses, people are actually able also to creatively contribute new responses to a situation. So as I interact with you, I'm learning about how you respond to me, and I'm adjusting my behavior, and you're adjusting your behavior accordingly. And in this sort of interaction, there's a reciprocal dynamic that takes place that's evolutionary in the sense that new options sort of show up in the situation. And we're developing expectations for each other's behaviors, beliefs, and even emotional states. And this sort of dynamic isn't at all captured by the standard diffusion model. There's no space for people to sort of learn and evolve the set of social options. And so this is sort of the way I want to explore norms and think about norms more generally. And I think the literature has been inhibited by the fact that we've thought about it only as a diffusion process. One of the most amazing things is that even though norms evolve through this sort of creative co-evolutionary process of people interacting with one another, once a norm becomes established, once everyone in the population is doing the same thing, and everyone has established expectations for one another, they're sort of lock-in. And it's very, very hard to kind of shift out of an equilibrium once it's established. Now, once an equilibrium is established, there can be a sort of a retroactive belief that there was some reason that that norm took hold, right? Either some way in which it was functional, or some way in which it's better than other options, some way in which it provides benefits to individuals or to the collective. But what sociologists tend to study is the fact that there are lots and lots of norms that are completely arbitrary. In fact, there are some norms, and this is my work on the emperor's dilemma focuses on this specifically, there are some norms which are detrimental to a population, both collectively and individually. There are so-called unpopular norms, norms which no one wants to engage in, but through the sheer process of social interaction and coordination, people wind up landing on these equilibria that are sort of universally welfare-reducing. And so when we confront this fact that we have not only norms that are arbitrary, but norms that are actually undesirable, the question is, where do they come from? If the explanation for a norm isn't that it's functional or beneficial, then we need some other reason, some other way of understanding how this process takes hold and how people over sort of large populations all wind up coordinating on behavior. So in the sort of literature that dates back hundreds of years, since really Hobbes and Hume and the sort of early social scientists trying to think about these problems, there are three sort of big answers. And the most famous of these is that there's essentially some kind of centralized authority, some kind of exogenous influence that coordinates a population. And the way we usually think about this is with governments. Right? Governments incentivize people to engage in certain behaviors, everyone's incentivized equally, and a population winds up converging on a social convention. Right? Now, that convention may or may not be beneficial to those people, but they're all coordinated on it. I think that this example is actually, in our day and age, more fitting when we think about firms and organizations. Organizations have very strong top-down leadership that often defines the culture of the firm. And we can think, for example, contrasting Palo Alto, Silicon Valley firms and the culture of how people dress, how people interact with each other professionally, and what the nature of gender relations is in those firms versus East Coast banking firms like Chase or JP Morgan. Right? And the standards and the expectations of how people are supposed to interact are sort of completely moderated by the expectations of the leadership. The problem is that when we think about this explanation, there are lots and lots of examples of emergent social norms, linguistic conventions, how we greet each other, expectations for politeness, expectations for gender conventions that aren't actually sort of governed by a top-down institutional structure. In fact, there's lots and lots of cases of emergent social norms that happen without any kind of mediating authority. And so we need an explanation that doesn't assume that there needs to be some kind of presence of an authority or an institution to govern this process. So one of the explanations in literature that's come up to solve this problem is this Harsanyian-Selton solution, which is essentially equilibrium selection. So if we've got a bunch of arbitrary solutions and we're trying to choose between them, how does the population wind up landing on one versus the other? And Harsanyi and Selton won the Nobel Prize for this work. And they essentially say, look, there's two basic reasons we wind up coordinating. One is that one option is significantly better than the other, and everyone's aware of that. And the other is that one option is sort of more preferred by the risk-averse people. It's a little bit safer than the other ones. And those two sort of reasons why we might choose one option over another are available and intelligible to everyone in the population. So we all see that A is better than B, or we all see that A is safer than B. And so individually, we gravitate towards A. Collectively, that has lock-in because we all see that we're all gravitating towards A. And then what you wind up is with a collective norm where everyone winds up doing A. The issue with this is that it also requires fairly thick institutional assumptions. We need to live in a world in which there are only two options, in which we know that there are only two options, in which we all know the corresponding payoffs for those options. In other words, we all have to know that A is better than B. And we all have to know that A is safer than B. And we all know that we all know, and so on and so forth. It's not just a cognitive burden that we all have to sort of have this information in our heads. It's actually an institutional burden, that the world actually has to be structured that way in order for norms to take hold. And again, the space that we think of empirically is a space where there's lots and lots of options. People are constantly contributing creatively to the set of options that we're all choosing from, and we can respond to each other and synthesize new options out of our interactions. And furthermore, we rarely know what the actual payoffs of the options are. And so to sort of assume that they're all lined up in a very clean payoff matrix that we all have access to is a really thick institutional assumption. So one of the responses to this, and the most contemporary way of thinking about this process, is to think about a sort of a collective feedback process. And this is sort of the popularity dynamics of a voting system or like a bestseller list, where one option starts to gain some traction just by accident. It starts to be chosen by people, and then there's some system that sort of samples the entire population, collates that information into some sort of centralized source, and then distributes it to the whole population in a way that everyone can find intelligible. Everyone's paying attention to that bestseller list or to that poll, and then they use that to make their subsequent judgments. Because everyone's doing a behavior, there's some information there that behavior may be desirable, more people do it, and so on and so forth, and the popularity cycle becomes reinforced and one option becomes dominant. Again, for this kind of explanation, the institutional assumptions are fairly thick. There needs to be an organization that's actually sampling the population, recording that information, collating it, and reporting it back in a way that everyone understands. Furthermore, everyone in the population needs to be paying attention to that signal and know that it exists, right? And so our question at the outset is, what if none of these institutions exist? What if we're just in sort of a state of nature? There's a bunch of people interacting. How do we ever get social coordination off the ground, especially at a large scale? Furthermore, there's sort of a conceptual paradox, which is that if we assume that some kind of institutional structure is necessary to get large-scale coordination off the ground, how do these institutions ever form in the first place? Right? And so this is where we start from. It's this kind of basic question of the emergence of social order. And the approach I'm going to talk about today is an evolutionary approach. This was pioneered by Ellison and Peyton Young, among others. And what it really assumes is that as people interact with one another in local settings, just trying to sort of get along with the people that they know in a day-to-day way, and those people interact with other people, and those people interact with other people, there's a co-evolutionary process that produces an emergent social norm over the entire population. When we think about these kinds of dynamics empirically, which range from linguistic conventions and the emergence of common terms, to greetings and belief about politeness, you can think about the evolution of greetings from, there are certain places where people kiss on the cheek, and there are certain places where people kiss on one cheek versus two. And then there are certain places where people shake hands, and now with the new innovation of the fist bump, right? Which is an odd greeting if you think about it, because the handshake was originally invented as a way of showing that you're not carrying weapons, right? And now we go to punch people as a way of introducing ourselves to them. So there's all kinds of sort of weird stories about the evolution of these particular patterns. And the curious thing is that in almost all of them, there are historical moments where they're codified and adopted by institutions and then become more formalized. If you ask someone, why do we use the term spam to refer to junk email? It's a really bizarre convention. What does a canned meat product have to do with what's in your electronic inbox, right? People will say, well, it's because of this Monty Python skit. People know this skit. So they go into a restaurant and they say, well, what do you want? And he says, well, we have spam, 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 and spam, right? That's what's on the menu. And that's one explanation. Another is that programmers used to eat a lot of spam. Another is that it's just a completely bizarre and unwanted product, and that's what junk email is, right? So there's lots of potential explanations. One person said to me, well, the reason we all use the word spam is because Google's junk inbox is called the spam folder. Right, but the irony here is that the reason that Google uses the term spam folder is because people were using the term spam, right? But when we look back historically, we see a moment where an organization or institution has kind of codified the norm, and we say, well, that's the explanation for it, because it's the most intuitive explanation available. So what we'd like to do is kind of get outside this historical stream and say, well, how does this happen when there are no institutions present? And is it even possible this can happen when there's no institutions present? So this is what motivates the method I'm going to use today. This is a method of sociological experimentation. I want to be really clear about this. This is not a psychology experiment. So most people think about when they think about an experiment is you take two people, you give one a stimulus or a treatment, and one you don't, and then you evaluate the differences in the outcomes. And you do that over and over again with these pairs, and then you evaluate the group 1 versus the group 2. You can't do that in sociology, particularly for this kind of problem, because what we're interested in is not how individuals behave, it's how collective norms form. It's how over an entire population, coordination through a social network produces global consensus or fails to produce global consensus. And so the strategy here, and I refer to Durkheim because Durkheim is, to me, the social scientist who first really clearly articulated this. What he was trying to do in Suicide was he was trying to compare societies side by side, and he went through pains to sort of eliminate all differences between these societies and say, look, if you take this society and this society, which are in principle the same in every respect, and just look at the one difference in the social structure, this society systematically and predictably generates different patterns of suicide than this society. And what this means is by simply changing the social structure, you change the collective outcome of the population. Even though people have no idea that there's a change in the social structure, there's no individual experience that's necessarily different. What's different is the underlying collective structure of the population. And that's the agenda here, is to show that by changing the underlying structure of a population, we can systematically generate differences in the global coordination of social norms. And the argument I'm going to focus on today is the structure of the social network. I'm going to argue that, and this is a causal, I want to be really clear, I want to flag this is a causal argument. I'm making a really clear causal claim. Saying changes in network connectivity cause the spontaneous emergence of social norms. And if you have certain social network connectivity, the same people with the same set of options will never converge on a social norm. And in another network, if you change in a certain way, you'll get global consensus on a norm in a very short time scale. And the point here is it doesn't depend on what the options are, whether they're good solutions or clever solutions or particularly attractive solutions. It's irrelevant. What matters here is the structure of the society. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of a theoretical background on this, talk about the experimental design, and get into the empirical findings, which are, of course, the fun stuff. So the background for this is that there's a sort of generation for the last couple of decades, models of emergent social conventions or emergence of norms. And essentially, we assume that there's extremely simple cognitive agents. These are agents who are just trying to coordinate with one another. Think of the minimal conditions for getting coordination individually and seeing how that aggregates up collectively. And the argument has been that if we connect people in different ways, this will affect the coordination dynamics. So these figures should be familiar to people in the room. Essentially, each little node here represents a person, and the links represent people they interact with. Right? And so this person here has 4 neighbors, this guy, this guy, this guy, that guy. And that person, over a series of pairwise interactions, just keeps sampling from those neighbors. So there's 20 interactions. They sample from these 4 neighbors repeatedly. So there's a couple things that happen. There's repeated interaction with the neighbors, and also these neighbors share neighbors in common with each other. So if a local norm forms here, then they can reinforce that norm with a third neighbor, right? So clustering and reinforcement for the repeated interactions should affect the dynamics of coordination. Here what we've done is rewire the network. So everyone still has 4 neighbors, but those neighbors are randomly distributed. So you repeatedly interact with the same 4 people, but those people don't interact with each other because their neighbors are random over the network. This kind of network, which is a random network, has a much smaller degree, a diameter, which means, in fact, if you take one person and say, how many steps for a piece of information to spread across the network, it's much, much faster in this case than in this case. In this case, it has to spread through the entire lattice. So that's an advantage of this network, and we think, well, this helps for information diffusion. That could affect the dynamics of coordination. And over here, we have basically random mixing or homogeneous mixing. And this is the case where essentially everyone's connected to everyone. The distance between anyone and anyone else is 1. So you pick one person out of the population, and now the people they can pick to play with is everyone else. So you pick someone else in the population, play with them, and put them back. So these are sort of fairly stylized network structures. As I say, realistic empirical networks don't look like this, right? But that's good for us. And it's good for us for the following reason. There are properties that we've identified in networks, such as clustering, such as path length modularity, and so forth, degree distribution. Computationally, we've explored this entire space. And it turns out that every network that you would find interesting or relevant in a sort of contemporary networks canon lies within this continuum in an uninteresting way, which is to say there's no nonlinearities in this space. If something happens here, in the space between this network and this network, we know exactly what happens. In the space between this network and this network, we know exactly what happens. A small world network falls in the continuum between a lattice and a random. A scale-free network falls in the continuum between a random and a homogeneous mixing. What that means for us empirically is we don't have to now sample the entire space of complex networks. If we understand what's happening here, we understand what's happening here, these two endpoints bookmark the entire space of interesting network dynamics that take place for these kinds of social evolutionary processes. So this gives us a very good grip on what we think is going to happen. So I'm going to show you now a simulation of what the sort of theory says about this space. This is based on Ellison's model of what he calls innovation diffusion, which is really the spread of new social norms, which he calls innovations. And here, each individual is shown as a gray dot, and when they interact with each other, the links will light up. If they coordinate, the nodes turn red. If they fail to coordinate, they'll turn back gray again. So people are playing this game, they're turning on and off as they play. And the right-hand case is the random mixing or homogeneous mixing case, and the lattice is the just local structured network. These networks have the same structure as the ones we just looked at. So what you can see, of course, is in the mixing case, people are interacting all over the network. In the lattice case, because people have interactions with neighbors repeatedly, and those neighbors have interactions with their own neighbors, this actually generates local coordination, which can spread from neighborhood to neighborhood and generate coordination across the network very, very quickly. By contrast, in the mixing case, people are selecting randomly from the population over and over again. There's no repeated interaction on a sort of a quick time scale. And what that means is that it's very, very hard for people to get any kind of sequence of exchange off the ground where we're doing the same thing with each other, because each interaction you have no expectation for the next person will do. So the lattice becomes, by default, really the expected condition where we get much more social coordination at a local and a global level than in homogeneous mixing. This has implications when we think about social networks more generally. What's happening in familiar spatial networks, which we can think of geographic networks, right, GIS systems, where people interact with neighbors in residential neighborhoods, that represents the sort of spatial lattice. The internet, where people are kind of interacting at random with the sort of whole world of people in a kind of continuous and resampling way, is much more like the connected mixing case. And so it suggests that we're much more likely to get coherent social norms off the ground in these sort of spatial settings than we are in these sort of distributed online settings. Where I want to push on these results, and this is where our research really picks up, is thinking about this concept of innovation. Is that really the right way of thinking about innovation? Because what they're doing in that game is they're basically choosing between a couple of options, going back and forth and seeing if they coordinate. But I'm interested in this question of what happens if people can spontaneously contribute to the set of options. It seems completely an artifice of the model in that case, that people can only decide to do what's defined a priori by the model, which is to say, if we're interacting and we're saying A and B, what happens if I just get bored with that and say C? Or I'm failing to interact and I propose a new option? How do those dynamics of new options entering the population affect the collective dynamics of coordination? And intuitively, it makes it much harder, right? Because if there are continually new options being introduced into the population, it means that in my local network, I may not have access to all the options people are using. People in a different part of the population may be trying out different things. So as more and more people try out more and more options, it makes the question of global coordination in a world where we don't really know what the global state of the world is extremely difficult. And it also changes our intuitions about how network structure should affect this process. If new options are spontaneously emerging in other parts of the network, now I don't necessarily have access to those unless I'm in a network that gives me access to what people are doing far away. And so now network structure can have helped from a diffusion perspective in giving me access to new options. And the clustered network structure, of course, helps from a coordination perspective. And so now coordination and diffusion are in tension with one another. What we want to start to understand is how these two sort of forces balance out in the emergence of coordination and social norms in this sort of more undefined social space. So when we reformalize this, we say there's a couple of constraints that weren't on the previous models, which is that, first of all, there's no a priori limit on the number of conventions. Any number, it's literally unbounded. Right? People can just keep contributing. And furthermore, this implies that as the process, the evolutionary process unfolds, new options can show up late in the game, which means that even though you have coordination, new options may take hold, and some options may die out, and you think, well, the population gets smaller and smaller, population of options. People just can spontaneously contribute later on. You think about all kinds of new media, music, television, books, and so forth. People are continually contributing to the space. People are continually investing in being spontaneous and original. And we want to sort of take this into account when we think about how social norms really emerge, especially in linguistic contexts. One of the important things about this is that the people you care about coordinating with are the people you actually interact with. Right? If everyone you know in your network is shaking hands and you hear that someone far away is kissing on the cheek, you're not going to go into work and start kissing people on the cheek, right? The norms that people are engaged in locally are the norms that coordinate you with the people who matter in your life. So people, not only do they only try to coordinate locally, they have no information whatsoever about the population as a whole. And so now our question under these really difficult constraints is to say, given an unbounded set of options, given the capacity to keep spontaneously contributing options, and also given no information what the population as a whole is doing, and no incentives to coordinate with the population as a whole, does the population as a whole nevertheless figure out global coordination? Right? So the way that we formalize this is based on a Wittgensteinian naming game. And the way he formalized it essentially where two people are looking at an object, and each person simultaneously presents a name for that object. At that point, rarely will they converge. But each person gets to hear the other person's response and use that, basically accrue a memory of what other people have said. And now they get to try again. Through the process of trial and error, these two people eventually will come to coordinate. Now our question, of course, isn't how two people do it. It's how people connected to others and others and others and others, all simultaneously engaged in this process, will collectively coordinate on a social norm. Now empirically, this has been really hard to study for the obvious reason. You have to study these dynamics in a way that allows you to get a grip on both the individual and spontaneous changes in behavior, and also the collective dynamics of coordination over a large population. That's a high demand. One of the primary guys in this space, his name is Luke Steele, who helped to invent this literature in the 80s and was doing a lot of lab group experiments with small groups. Gave up entirely on humans and has now moved to Sony Labs. This is like a top secret picture from Sony Labs. And he has these robots playing the Wittgensteinian naming game, where they're pointing at objects and trying to come up with coordination on specific terms. Now, it's interesting, and you may actually learn a lot from this kind of process, but for the question we're after, you don't learn anything. Just say, even if you can get two robots to figure it out, it doesn't tell you how individuals interacting with other individuals with other expectations, who again are interacting with other people with other expectations and so forth, collectively figure out the problem. So this is what motivates the empirical work that I'm going to present today. It's worthwhile to mention that a lot of work has been done in this space, and most of the empirical stuff has been done in small group laboratories, and this again took off really in the 80s. And it's pretty amazing work. It's pretty impressive. They put people into labs and gave them a problem to solve and no linguistic structure in which to solve it, and people interacting with each other they basically invented entirely new languages. So it really sort of captures that sort of space of creative evolution of conventions. The problem is that in these small group labs, you could really only do this at a very small scale. This is like 2 people interacting, or maybe 4, or at a very, very, very big experiment. You can imagine how long this would take in a lab, like 10 people doing this process together. It's extremely hard. Now, for our purposes, and this is again where the models become extremely useful, these models identify what's called a critical point in the dynamics, which means below that critical point, the dynamics behave one way, and above that critical point, they behave another way. In physics, these are called finite size effects. So the critical point for the system is around 20, which means that systems that are below 20 will behave qualitatively different than systems that are above 20. That's really important. It doesn't mean that we get to ignore everything, because there's a lot of valuable lessons learned from these small group experiments. But it means those data, all of them, don't generalize to larger systems. We have no information about how the world behaves above that. And since what we're interested in is large-scale social coordination, and the networks that we're thinking about at scale, at even the county or the state or the national level, are quite large, what we're interested in is what happens in very large populations. Now, the good news about this particular property of physical systems is that above that critical point, it means that once we understand the system above it, that should generalize, right? It should scale up to very large systems. Once we understand the system with 30 or 50 or 100, that should scale up to 100,000 or 100 million, right? And that's the beauty of these kinds of theories, is it gives us a grip both on what we can't do and what we can't infer in small systems, but we can infer once we're above that critical point about large systems. So I think that this gives us a lot of hope in thinking about, look, if you want to understand how 61 million people are going to act, you don't need a 61 million person data set, right? All you need is a system that you understand above a critical point, and then you can make inferences for larger populations. There are people who have tried to do larger experiments with economic games. Now, economic games are interesting. People give a choice of A or B, and then there's payoffs for A and B, and they see people coordinate. But what this does is this eliminates the whole space of creativity and spontaneity that we're interested in. Right? There's basically a thick institutional structure. In these cases, people are usually given incentives for global coordination, and then we see if the network structure affects their outcome. But of course, we want to know if there's no incentives for global coordination and there's no information about what the possible set of options are, can they still do it? And so what we're inclined to do in that point is move to sort of an observational data space, where people say, well, you know who solves that problem? Big data solves that problem. Big data has large data sets, everyone's connected in a network, they're all interacting with each other, and you have real-time behavior change. You have lots of spontaneous things happening, and you can see the emergence of collective behaviors. It's absolutely true. Big data does address those first two issues. But the problem with big data is that it's observational. Right? So now we're in a space where all of those forces that we were interested in ruling out initially, the institutional forces of exogenous influence, of differential incentives, of leadership, and so forth, now are back inside the data. And we have no way of getting out the causal story, which is how does this process of social coordination emerge all by itself? And even can it emerge all by itself in the absence of these institutions? So this is what leads me to the method I'm going to talk about today, which is the sociological experiments method. One final thing is this idea of replication or reproducibility. So people typically don't worry about this in social science. And the reason is it's extremely hard to get a good data set. And if you get a good data set, you pretty much just stick with that and say, I'm going to fudge a little bit that things aren't IID. But I want to think about this social process in particular. Right? This is a process where by construction, we're interested in the interdependent interactions of individuals in a co-evolutionary process. If you have 100,000 people interacting in a social network who are collectively producing one social norm, how many data points do you have? Right? And so I maintain you don't have 100,000 data points, you have one data point. You have one instance of the emergence of a social norm. And if you want to reproduce that process, if you want n more than one, you actually need to reproduce entire societies. You need to watch that entire collective process take place again in a new social system. And so replication and causal inference don't come from large data sets, they come from replication of independent societies. And so this is the model that I've been using over the last couple of years to develop the sort of web-based social experiment method. And essentially the intuition is, and this is where I was mentioning Durkheim at the beginning, the intuition is that we can create two societies, put them side by side, and everything about those societies from the user's perspective, from the individual psychological perspective, is identical. You can't distinguish these two apart. And that's important because in your day-to-day society, Facebook aside, if I were to say, what does your social network look like? You could kind of name some people. I said, what does their social network look like? Draw it out for me, 2 steps, 3 steps away. You have no idea what that world looks like. And nor, in many cases, do you care what that world looks like, right? All you really care about is what your sort of individual user experience looks like from a first-person perspective. And so this is the world that we imagine when we create these online experiments, where we say, all right, we're giving people a world, giving these people a world where their daily experience is the same. What's different is the underlying social structure that connects them. And the theory is that we're systematically going to be able to grow collective behaviors in this world that won't show up in that world. Right? And then, of course, the point is replication. We can take these pairs and do it again and again and again and again, and we'll get the same systematic results. And that gives us a causal grip on how social structure produces emergent collective behaviors. So the formal structure for this experiment is based specifically and exactly on the model. So again, two people come into a space, they're given an object, they simultaneously try to name that object, and then they're given feedback on what other people did, and they engage in this process of an evolutionary process or a repeated process of trying to coordinate. In this case, the object is a face, and our goal is to see how the pattern of interaction affects that coordination dynamic. So when people arrive to the site, and people are recruited, I can talk about this at the end, people are recruited through online advertisements, various websites, and groups like Reddit and so forth. And they're invited to come play online games. And so what happens is they come to this waiting page. Now you can imagine what's going on in the background. Essentially, the two network structures, or the three I described, the lattice, the random, and the fully connected, are sitting here and they're empty. And as people are coming, they're basically kind of put into a big pool. And as that pool fills and fills and fills, if we get enough people to fill these networks, then everyone's randomly slotted into these three networks, right? And once those three networks are filled, then we can start an experiment. So when an experiment starts, this is what it looks like. This is what the sort of user experience is. On the left-hand side, you can see that there's a list of other players. There's a face, and you can type in a name for that face and hit enter. And there's a list of rounds. You're going to play a game that's 20 rounds, and you have 20 seconds per round. You type in the name. Well, I typed in the name Kelsey. You may disagree. So the other people have really strong preferences. When we were testing this out with the developers, it was amazing. One of my developers got really upset because we coordinated on the name Michelle, and they're like, Michelles aren't blonde. And I was like, okay, okay, right. So then the other person simultaneously is typing in a name. You both hit enter, and this is the important part of this. If you fail to coordinate, the name the other person typed in shows up on your screen. So now you're developing a memory. You know what you typed in, and you know the other person knows what you typed in, and you know what they typed in. So now you have this kind of list of two names, and they have a list of two names. And through a repeated process, you're both kind of incrementing this list. Of course, if you match, it says here that you matched. If you fail, it says here you failed. And if you match, you're rewarded. You get paid for matching. Interestingly, if you fail, we take money away. Now, a scientist running experiments that are essentially gambling is illegal, so I can't take money away from people below zero, but I can take money away that I gave them. Right? So I can basically adjust their rewards based on their success in this process. On the left-hand side, this is an important point. Regardless of what the network structure is, or even the size of the population, that list of names looks the same. It's really important. Because if I gave you information about how large the population was or who you were interacting with, you could infer something about the structure of the population. And the point here is to say, no one in any condition has any structural information. And we want to see now if we get differential effects of structure, even with no information about it. I'm going to move on. I'm just going to get right into the data now, which data are results in this case. But so before I do that, I want to know if there's any questions about this, because the data won't make sense unless you understand the experience. Yeah?
Just clarify.
Yeah, of course.
What are the incentives for gaining cash?
So let me be really clear. In all the studies we run, people are not paid for showing up. Right, so no one is ever incentivized just to come to an experiment. What we always do, the incentives are always aligned with the behavior we're interested in. So in this case, we want to reward coordinating and punish failed coordination. So essentially, if you coordinate, you get a quarter. And if you fail to coordinate, you lose like 20 cents. Oh, so if I typed in Kelsey, and simultaneously you typed in Kelsey, and we both hit submit, then it shows up and says, you guys matched. Now, we were actually pretty sensitive about this. So if someone typed in a lowercase k, that failed, right? It was text specific. And I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of things people did. I ran this initially when I was at MIT, and people did things, you have to expect this. People typed in code, right? So 200 lines of code, and pasted it in there just to see if they could hack it. People never coordinated on that, unfortunately. So yeah.
You're assuming they're coordinating with each other in the game. How do you know they're not coordinating to the list of names, priming a certain identity on the left of the screen?
Yeah, that could happen. It never happened. Which is to say, how do we? We have the complete record of names. So the list of names, none of these ever showed up in the selections that people made.
Different arguments.
Okay.
You've got two wickeds, you've got a playa, and you've got a killer.
Oh, so these are, sorry, this is for demonstration. These are things I made up. This isn't the actual, what people put in here were their own usernames, right? So Damon, and it would say that here, right? So it's a list of other usernames that people put into the population, right?
How do you know that list of names, constant across conditions, isn't priming associations, and you're actually coordinating to it, not to each other?
It totally could, but because that's held constant across conditions, it doesn't affect experimental validity, right? Yep.
I just wonder, why is that a norm? I understand what you're trying to do, but why did you choose naming as a substitute for norm?
Yeah. So this goes
unless norm is a name. Norman.
What's that? Is that the whole point of that question was just to say that, right? That was Cheers. So I can smile and move on then. Yeah, we can get into this discussion about what's a convention and what's a norm. Fundamentally, the framing is around social conventions, and that's how we think of this process. And anything where people are coordinating in an undefined space, this is what Harsanyi and Selton are talking about when they talk about equilibrium selection. It's the sense that there's an arbitrary set of social choices. Anything once it's locked into is in equilibrium, but the question is, how do we get there? What are the out of equilibrium dynamics of a coordination game? And it's just a pure coordination game. And that formalization is the formalization that most people use when they talk about norms and conventions. Okay, so one of the beautiful things about doing an online experiment is that instead of, I'm not going to show you any regressions, regression tables, no stars, right? There will be a p-value at some point, but it's kind of irrelevant. So the value of doing that is the data collected online are so clear because of the fact that you're really just creating a world where you want to observe these dynamics, that I'm just going to show you the raw data. I'm just going to play you back literally a movie of what happened in real time, so you can just watch it. Now, everyone will tell you, especially when you're in grad school, you should never show raw data in a talk, but this is one of those cases where you can just do that, and it's actually more illustrative than an analysis would be. All right, so this looks much like the figure that we started out with when we were looking at a simulation. I want to highlight, these are data, this is not a simulation, right? I've come to the end of this talk and people are like, those simulations you showed at the end. No, these are real people doing real activities, okay? So these dots represent people. When they interact, the links show up. When someone chooses a name that the node lights up with the corresponding color, on the right-hand side, you're going to see a histogram. And next to the names, there'll be a bar representing that color. So blue will show Susan, and then you'll see blue here. It's a real histogram. So if more and more nodes light up blue showing Susan, then the actual bar for Susan will increase, right? And that changes over time. People can change their mind. They can go back. So the bars are growing and shrinking in real time as the nodes are changing. One other thing is that if two people choose the same name, the link that lights up between them is also the color of the name. So if two people chose Susan, they both light up blue and the link lights up blue. If two people interact and they chose different names, then the nodes will be different colors and the link between them will show up as white. Okay, so what you can see is as people interact very quickly, the set of names increases, right? There's sort of this acceleration in options in the population. And also what you see is some coordination, right? You see the name Sarah getting traction at the top of the lattice, the name Elena getting traction in the bottom. Some interesting options show up. And this is where I think of this as trying to cheat in some ways. People typed in blue eyes. Someone typed in beautiful and sexy, gorgeous, sunshine, crystal. Right, so people are trying to, in some ways, outsmart the game. They're going to type in a category and see. And this is in some ways a good solution, because no one can disagree with blue eyes because she's got blue eyes. But what's beautiful about this is that it doesn't affect at all the dynamics. The quality of the solutions that were put in didn't affect whether or not those solutions were selected. You can see here boundary effects forming. Here you've got a group. Even though no one has a concept of group, nevertheless, you have a boundary here and a boundary here, another group here. And you've got basically 5 groups. You've got Samantha, Sarah, and Elena taking sort of dominance, and then a couple of smaller groups. And as this unfolds more, you can see these sort of boundary effects where this norm here, the red one, Lisa, propagated inside the Elena group and then was ultimately kind of subsumed by the neighbors who were saying Elena. The dynamics here are really quite interesting because if you were to study this in a model, and you had someone here on the border, and they were frustrated because their neighbors were saying A and B and A and B and A and B, the person in the model would just keep going back and forth between A and B. What happens in real human populations is someone goes A, B, A, B, A, B, F, right? They just suggest a new option, and F may propagate, F may die out, or they may go back to saying A or B, or people may synthesize. People may say, well, AF then in that case. Right, so there's lots of different options that can happen. I think that the human nature of the data are pretty interesting, just in terms of what we would or wouldn't expect in terms of natural reactions to this kind of space. What's also interesting is that something can be adopted. Right, this person can say a certain name, and it can fail a sequence of times, and that person goes back and starts using some other name that was used previously. That name, of course, was heard by this person, who may repeat it to this person and this person and this person. Meanwhile, the name may die out. So what can happen is that this name shows up over here in the network, and there's no trace of it. There's no intervening trail, which is extremely unlike a diffusion process. Whereas the technology spreads, there's a record of it spreading. You can see kind of its path. And in this case, things can propagate and disappear and pop up other places where it seems spontaneous, right? And we see this with innovation diffusion all the time. It seems spontaneous, but in fact, there was a trail that led from one area to another area. Now, of course, the main result for this is that we see the emergence of these sort of organized spatial regions. This is not unlike what we see in the US for things like soda versus pop, right? And we think about this, we tend to attribute these differences to sort of group identity. People represent themselves and have a concept of themselves as belonging to one group or another. The beautiful thing about this is you get these really well-organized spatial divisions of norms, and people have no concept of themselves as a group. Right, they have no idea if there's a group this size or a group that size, if there's boundary effects. There's nothing there in terms of the sort of what's in the head. Nevertheless, collectively, we see the same patterns of social disorganization or sort of social competition. But of course, our question is, well, what about the network structure, the population structure could affect this to produce global coordination? So in this next case, we randomize the network. Oops. Randomize the network and watch the process unfold again. The dynamics actually look a lot the same. It's harder to see the structure because it's a random network. It's harder to see the sort of organization of groups. But if you look over here to see the histogram, you see that we have about the same number of dominant names, 3 to 4 dominant names. And the size, let's just say their market share in the population is about the same. Like the level of popularity of any given name never exceeds about 30 to 40%. And then it sort of goes up and down from there. And this is surprising in some ways because this network structure for the dynamics of diffusion is like when people say a random network is so much better than a clustered network for diffusion, the diameter is so much smaller, it affects things in so many ways. But for these dynamics, the actual collective process is unaffected, which is sort of surprising and leads us to ask the question, well, can we even solve this problem at all? And so we move here to a homogeneous mixing case. And in this case, what you'll notice is very, very quickly, the number of names increases. That's faster than any of the other ones. Right, you've already got 2 columns of names in the first couple seconds. And it's because people are interacting with strangers. Right? Every time you interact, you're getting a new name from someone, and you're trying to figure out what to do. And so any suggestion could be a good one, because you don't know what's going to happen. Surprisingly, this sort of high level of randomness in the initial process actually gives rise to a change in the collective dynamics, whereby one name gains a level of popularity that never happened in the other cases. Right? The name John sort of takes off and becomes sort of a dominant name in the population, and ultimately saturates, becoming used by everyone. So you've got 24 strangers interacting in this online space. They have no idea who's in there or what their histories are. Nevertheless, they've collectively produced a social norm. Right? It's the same as in the other conditions in terms of the user experience, but the actual collective dynamics are quite different. We use gender parity in each case, right? So you're going to ask if it's a male name versus a female name. In every case, we used male and female names and replicated these again and again and again. We're able to generate the same results. And in fact, when you compare these results across conditions, this is the experimental data. The y-axis here is the popularity or the market share of each name, and the x-axis is just time. And so what you can see here is names are bumping around, and one name gains popularity about 40% and then drops down. Another one gets up to 40%, but no name gains popularity above 40%. Right? The same thing happens in the random network. It's quite interesting that the dynamics are not just qualitatively similar, they're quantitatively similar. And we're looking at basically the same dynamics in both these very different network structures. We move over here to the homogeneous mixing, and we get takeoff here. We get critical mass, and the system just explodes, and you get universal coordination on a very quick time scale. Right? And remember, the individual experience is the same in these cases, which is what's so striking about it. Also, if you think about this concept of critical mass, people are always asking, what's the size of the critical mass? How do we get these things off the ground? Here, you had 40% of the population. It was ineffective. Here, by the time you got 30% of the population, it actually took off and wound up becoming a winner-take-all, right? The one that wound up dominating the population. So if you saw these data, you'd say, well, 40% is ineffective. It's not enough to be the critical mass. And if you saw these data, you'd say, well, 30% is all we need to create the critical mass. The point here is that the term critical mass is meaningless unless we're talking about the network structure, the population structure in which this process is taking place. Right? Critical mass depends decisively on how people are connected. The beautiful thing about this is if you compare this experimental data to the theory, it's a little bit uncanny. Not only are they qualitatively similar, they are sort of identical numerically, which is really unlikely. In fact, when we ran this the first time, this was so exciting and also terrifying, we didn't even want to run it again. Like, it's a perfect fit, just stop. You know, and so you see the same pattern here where you get about 40% success being the dominant, and here you get very quick takeoff. And then our question here was, all right, so now we know we're above this critical point of n equals 20, and this should generalize to very large populations. We've got a theoretical argument that says that we're sort of in the general space, but we'd like to think about what this means if we actually do that empirically. And again, it's sort of nerve-wracking as a scientist to do that, because you could, if you wrote the paper at that point, having replicated it at 24, you could say, and the theory says it generalizes. We didn't have time, resources, blah, 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 to replicate, and that's it. And everyone goes, yeah, that's reasonable. Right? But we were actually genuinely interested in whether or not it happened. So we ran it again. We doubled the population size and ran it again. And you have to picture, this is 50 people interacting online randomly within a 5-minute window. And within the same time scale, they're all collectively coordinating on a social norm. And again, this was replicated several times. And now we were, again, the sort of excitement and terror go side and side. We're like, what if we doubled the population again? Like, would that work? I'm like, yeah, we don't want to know if it doesn't work, right? Because at this, like, we're safe now, right? We've shown that it generalizes. But we ran it again with 100 people and got the same results on the same time scale, which again is remarkable. And so now again, this is 100 people who come to a website and are playing each other randomly, and collectively within just a few minutes are all agreeing on a social norm. Whereas 24 people in a lattice couldn't figure it out, right? But 100 people in this network, so 4 times the size, and you're getting the same dynamics. Yeah.
Am I reading that last one right? That it looked like there was competition?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That's right. And you see, actually, that happens in all of these. There's always competition. It's more pronounced in this one just because the network is larger. It's easier to see. Yeah. So the dynamics here, and this is kind of for the physicists in the audience. Mason, what's up? So, no, I'm kidding. So this is the dynamics here. The kind of underlying principle is called symmetry breaking. And what it means, symmetry means that at this stage, any option can win. And here's the distribution of options. So some are higher, some are lower, but that ranking keeps shifting, right? An option that's almost out can actually gain traction and come back and become a top option. A top option can go down and become a lower option, and this sort of bouncing around process unfolds. What happens here is this key phenomenon where the distribution of options shifts so steeply that the top option has so much market share that other options are now being forced to extinction. Right? This is what's called a winner-take-all system. Right? Essentially, it eliminates its competition just by its own success. And then at this point, it's a foregone conclusion. I mean, we can actually stop it here. We know what's going to happen. It's a mathematical certainty that the system is going to take off and you're going to get a winner-take-all society. And the amazing thing about that process is that we're able to replicate it so systematically. And so now what we can say, we can make this causal claim, is that we can create social structures that generate winner-take-all societies, right? And replicate it again and again and again. Now, I insisted, we submitted this, this came out in the PNAS in February. And when we initially submitted it, it went to, this is very rare, I think, for PNAS. It was on PNAS, you can do a major and a minor subject. And the major was social sciences and the minor was physics. I think that doesn't happen a lot. And Andrea said, you know, what's a p-value? Like, why do you need that? He's a statistical physicist. And I was like, no, but social scientists want to see that it's significant. He's like, look at it. You know, what do you know p-value for? You know, and you know, I think he's right. I mean, the qualitative evidence is the strongest evidence. Like, you really just see there's a significant difference between these two things. And what this did is this. So this is the sort of major finding from this paper, and it raised a lot of questions. Now, at that time, as Michael mentioned, I was at the Center for Advanced Study last year. So this is the Palo Alto area. So this came out in February, and people were, you know, I was at a cocktail party. People were talking about this paper, and someone said, you know, you should think about it in light of this thing. So do people remember this? The dress, dreaded dress, right? So I said, the what now? I said, you know, the dress. Everyone's talking about it. There's this sort of phenomenon with your monitor or, you know, your cognitive perceptual structure. People see it as, you know, black and blue, or people see it as white and gold. And as the more you described it, I was like, you've got massive social polarization on like an arbitrary characteristic. And I was like, well, if you have massive social polarization, that's a social phenomenon. Right? There's no way that the cognitive structure of the world is divided in some sort of binary fashion. Everyone sees it this way versus that way. Right? There's some kind of social process going on. And then I started wondering, you know, in light of the results here on collective coordination, whether that social process could be controlled, right? Thinking about, all right, you've got these dynamics of public opinion or dynamics of social norm emergence where people are interacting with one another and no one is directing the process. No one even wants social coordination, and nevertheless it's happening endogenously. So what if you had a few actors in that space who actually had an agenda, right? Could they actually sort of hijack that process? And so I got on Skype with the folks in the network dynamics lab, and I was like, run the name game, but throw this picture up there. And they got everyone to coordinate on black and blue, and then introduced a committed minority. This is the graduate students, committed. And they typed in white and gold, and remarkably, you got this shift in the trend, and then ran this again, and got this shift to actually cross 50% and take over and go to saturation, right? And so you get this tremendous flexibility of norms where people are committed to one thing, it's entrenched, and then you can flip it. And this actually got me really excited about this space now. This is the kind of thing that we're thinking about. This was my first op-ed piece, Controlling Public Opinion, about the dress, whatever that means. So we started thinking about what this means more generally in terms of norms in society. And I was talking to a colleague once, this actually happened in a talk, where this guy looked like that. So be careful of the questions you ask. He asked me, this guy looked like that. He asked me a question, and he said, he had blonde hair, blue eyes, and light skin. He said, you may be able to get names that look like you get female names for females and male names for females, but you could never get a name like, and said some African-American female name. So you could never get a name like that for me, right? And I thought, well, this guy's making my point, right? Because the whole point is that norms are incredibly flexible, is that the dynamics of people interacting with people generate coordination on norms, and our belief that there's some sort of intrinsic difference between that name or that name and could never happen is exactly the kind of thing I want to interrogate here. So we ran this experiment where we had these 4 names bouncing around. You can see at every point, each name has the opportunity to gain dominance. Here, red and green are the dominant ones. Here, cyan, red, and green are tied. Green actually takes dominance here. Purple is matched here, and then red and green are competing, and red winds up winning. Now, the question to ask yourself is, what could red be? What's possible in this space? And what wound up happening was, you can see purple is Hans, cyan is Sean, green is Eric, and red is Nia, right? And this gave rise to me, this is exactly what I wanted to say. And subsequently, like a couple months later, that kid was in another, I gave a talk, and he was in the audience, and I got to say, so in answer to your question, right? And so what this does to me is this opens up the space of our kind of ability to interrogate social norms, and more generally, and think about the dynamics by which we get sort of large-scale social coordination on things that we wouldn't necessarily think are flexible. And Cecilia Ridgway's work, she's a social psychologist at Stanford. I've been really impressed by her stuff for a long time. This is on status characteristics theory. Status characteristics theory is that there are certain characteristics that stand out as salient in social interactions and determine who's dominant, right, who's influential. And Cecilia, as a sociologist, interrogated this and said, what we're doing is just a psychologist saying this is a dominant feature. But why is it a dominant feature? Certainly these are socially constructed. She started doing experiments on arbitrary characteristics and showing they could become dominant in certain situations. And so one of the things we're thinking about now is what the applicability of these kinds of dynamics are, is the emergence of status norms, of who has influence or doesn't have influence in a given situation. Of course, one of the other applications here is to health. Obviously, we think about social norms. Exercising isn't a binary decision, right? It's how many times a day do you exercise? How intensively do you exercise? There's all kinds of choices you have to make, and those things are coordinated with the other people that you're engaged in. Right? Your normative expectations do a huge amount of work to determine what you're going to do, and what you do feeds back to affect the normative expectations of your group, right? So we can think about the ways in which online communities can be used or manipulated to affect the dynamics of social coordination and exercise patterns. Of course, one of the other things that's most interesting to us is, look, if you can get large-scale coordination, that's incredibly interesting, but what if the decision matters? Not just that people are coordinating, but there's some meaningful difference between one option and another option, right? It's a better choice for people, or in some cases, a more accurate or correct choice, like medical decision-making. Is this safe or not safe, right? What's the consensus? Vaccination, yes or no, right? So we've got all these sorts of dynamics of coordination, and we'd like to understand how accuracy plays into this. So we're now running experiments I'll talk about in a minute that look at collective intelligence in the group dynamics and how that's a function of the network structure that people are interacting in. And finally, invoking Leninist roots, if we were to mobilize social change, right, what could a small committed minority do? What could a vanguard of people do in a social space? And the point here is that in a spatial network, it's extremely hard to mobilize social change and large-scale coordination. Any one group is sort of constrained by the network structure and the limits of the topology. In the vastly connected online space, because the dynamics naturally and endogenously take us to large-scale social coordination, even though no one's trying to, and no one's even aware of it. If you have a few people trying to push an agenda, they can be highly effective in that space. And that's one of the things that we're thinking about now as we sort of move forward. So the question that motivated this research is, are social institutions necessary in order to produce large-scale social conventions? And the answer is no. Conventions at a very large scale can emerge completely endogenously without any institutions present. And furthermore, whether or not this happens depends decisively on the connectedness of the population, which means that we have sort of, in some sense, a causal understanding of the conditions that are necessary for the emergence of social order. And of course, from a sort of applied perspective, this means that small groups can be highly effective under these special circumstances at actually sort of motivating social change. That's the end of the talk. I want to sort of just put in a plug here and say, the next thing we're doing here on Collective Intelligence, this is Devin Brackbill's PhD project, is the Annenberg Data Science Competition. This is extremely exciting. So what we're doing is we're looking at the application of these kinds of dynamics to collective problem solving. So we imagine a group of people trying to solve a hard problem in data science. So everyone in the room will be invited, on Tuesday? Is that right? Tuesday, to participate in this. So data science is good times, lots of fun. And you'll be given a very hard stats problem, and everyone, faculty and students alike, are invited to try to solve it. And the idea is by connecting people in different ways, can we actually design collaboration networks that produce deeper insight into these hard data problems? And our argument is, in fact, that we can in a very systematic way. And furthermore, there's lots of prize money to be won by people who participate. So we'll be interested to see what happens. Thank you very much, and I'll take your questions. Yeah.